wherever you are and whenever you are. Welcome, good souls, to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith. Join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal portals and tantalizing turnoffs. Tonight's guest is Philip Mantle, and I'll bring him on in just a moment. For all of you who are listening live on KGRA, this is a pre-recording. So while this is weeks before you hear this, I wish you all a happy Easter. And obviously, we won't have the open lines tonight, so don't try to call in. But you can tag me on Twitter if you have any post-show questions or comments, and that's at paranormal_now. So as of late, I have been asking you to pop on over to the Paranormal Pop channel on YouTube. If you could do so, please like, subscribe to that channel. We have more content coming in the coming months, and I have some major life changes in my life that I will soon share with you that will actually open up possibilities to do more content that I'd like to do on that channel. And of course, on KGRA, please like, subscribe, comment down below on the YouTube channel there as well. And if you're listening to this live on KGRA, if you don't want to miss any future shows of Paranormal Now or any of our wonderful KGRA programs, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, so our guest, Philip Mantle, he is an UFO expert. And many of you do know Philip Mantle, and he has done a wide array of work, including books, videos, interviews. So, Philip, welcome to Paranormal Now.
Yeah, good evening, Alan.
Good evening. So you've covered such a wide array of topics related to ufology. And I noticed that you're often referred to as UFO expert. What do you prefer, ufologist or expert?
I'm certainly no expert. I'm just an ordinary fellow like the rest of you.
Well, see, that's what broadcasters do, right? They apply names for you and titles for you. So you just consider yourself what, an enthusiast?
Yeah, just a UFO researcher, and that's it.
Okay, great. So how did you get involved in the subject of UFO research in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, going back to my younger days, as far back as I can remember, Alan, I was always interested in the paranormal, the space race. I was born in 1958. So, as an 11-year-old, I watched the moon landings in awe. But as I progressed into high school, my interest in all things paranormal seemed to take over. And I was quite fortunate in some respects because my best friend's grandmother lived literally the opposite side of the road. And she used to go to the spiritualist church. So on occasion, I would go along with her. And I found it fascinating. Didn't necessarily believe everything, kept an open mind, but it certainly, sparked the interest. Then at some point, I read a book on astronomy that had one chapter in it about UFOs, basically dismissing them. I still can't remember the title of that book to this very day, but it nonetheless got me intrigued. So, I left high school when I was 16, not really knowing what to do with myself. Went around a couple of jobs. And then in late 1978, over into 1979, I worked in what was the old West Germany. Now, I couldn't speak the language, not a word of it. So I asked my mum to send me some books. So she sent me a box of books, and it just so happened they were all about UFOs. So I don't know where she got them from. And so on an evening, I would sit and read. So by the time I came back to the UK in 1979, the interest was definitely there. And I lived in a county called West Yorkshire in the north of England. And we lived about 5 miles from the city of Leeds. And Leeds, even to this very day, still publishes an evening newspaper. It's called the Yorkshire Evening Post. And my aunt, who lived around the corner from us, she brought me the newspaper one day. And in it was a small advertisement. And it was for the formation of the Yorkshire UFO Society. It was coming up that Sunday. So come Sunday, I got on a bus. I didn't drive at that point. Went into the city of Leeds, found the location, And the Yorkshire UFO Society was set up by two brothers. They were Graham and Mark Birdsall. There's about 20 or 30 people there. Mm-hmm. And Graham and Mark put on a presentation. And that was me hooked, Alan. I found I'd come home almost. I felt so at ease. I could get some more books, which was great as well. I was a great book fan. Graham, of course, went on many years later to publish UFO magazine here in the UK, which was a big success. Sadly, he's no longer with us. But, that was it. I felt I'd found my niche, and that's how it all began.
Yeah. So you were born and raised in England?
Yes, my mum was from Northern Ireland. My father was from Wales. He died when I was a toddler. My mum remarried some years later. So my stepfather, he was from Poland. But my sister was born in Ireland. My brother was born in Wales. I'm the only one out of the family that was born in England. And I was born in the county of West Yorkshire. And so I'm known as a bit of a stubborn Yorkshireman. So yeah, but born and bred.
And where are you now?
I only live about 8 miles from where I was born, Alan. I now live in a small town called Pontefract in West Yorkshire. It's not famous for anything apart from licorice. It makes a lot of licorice here. If you eat what you call candies that made by Haribo, well, there's a big Haribo factory here that makes them. And there's a famous Charlie Chaplin silent movie where he gets so hungry that he takes off his boot and eats it. Well, that boot was actually made here in Pontefract. It was made from licorice.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was an old Roman town. The Romans were here, 1800 years ago. We have the remains of a castle in the city, in the town, that played a big part in the Civil War here in the UK. Not much of it left now, but every now and again, some of the Roman items still come to light. So, Pontefract's been around a long time.
Can one still get a boot made of licorice?
We can get licorice. I mean, every year we have a licorice festival in the town. Not this year because of COVID, but I'm sure it'll be back next year. And there are thousands come to it, Alan. And so keep buying Haribo. It'll keep the town ticking over.
Haribo, the first thing that comes into my mind are gummies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's what I think of when I think Haribo. So as a researcher, does it matter your locale? Some people are attracted to maybe here moving to New Mexico or to a bigger city where there's more resources. Does it make any difference to where you're located? Are you less or more effective?
It certainly didn't when I began my involvement. I mean, when I joined the Yorkshire UFO Society, for quite a while, we used to have monthly meetings. I would just turn up and, just soak information in.
Sure. Yeah.
We were fortunate that in the early 1980s, Yorkshire used to be one big county, Alan, and then it was split up north, south, east, and west to make 4 counties. So in the north, in North Yorkshire, we have a national park. It's called the Yorkshire Dales, a very beautiful part of the world. I'd advise all American tourists to go there when they can. But there's a market town called Skipton. It's not remarkable for anything in particular. Now, outside of Skipton, there are moors and dales. And there's a small village called Carlton. Mm-hmm. The moor above it was simply called Carlton Moor. For whatever reason, Alan, in the early 1980s, these areas in and around the market town of Skipton had a lot of UFO sightings. And, one way or another, a lot of them found their way to us at the Yorkshire UFO Society. So I'd really joined at the right time. This is all a long time before the internet, of course. Mm-hmm. And so we had plenty to keep ourselves occupied with regards to research and investigation. I mean, the sightings that came in, Alan, were everything you could think of, from strange lights in the skies, photographs, strange encounters. I mean, everything came our way at one point or another. So it's like you say, some people will move to a location to get more involved. Well, I was just fortunate I didn't have to move. It was already there, and it found us. And it kept us occupied for years, literally for years.
Do you believe that extraterrestrials are real?
Good question. I mean, I've no doubt, like many people, that the universe is full of life. Mm-hmm. Whether it's visiting the planet Earth is a different question, and I would never rule it out. But I think where we stand today, currently, we can't prove that. If you believe in the extraterrestrial hypotheses, proving it beyond reasonable doubt, like you would do in a court of law, I think it would be very, very difficult indeed. However, our knowledge of the universe is growing all the time.
Yeah,
and
but you think that there's tangible evidence then to suggest that they are real? I mean, after all, you spent decades.
There is evidence that the UFO phenomena is real. Mm-hmm. But then you put that to one side and say, okay, we have a tangible phenomena here that we can study. Mm-hmm. But then there's the question is, well, what is the nature and origin of the phenomena? And that's where the difficult part comes in.
It's not like ufology where you can, just dig, look at a strata, what you're looking at, what you're studying, so you know how to approach it, right? You can build a system around it.
That's right, yes. However, when archaeology was in its early days, mm-hmm. They didn't have that. They would literally dig holes and blow things up,
like a pyramid. Yeah.
So the archaeology became a science in its own right, but it didn't become a science overnight. It took a long time. So did astronomy. I mean, many of our ancestors going back centuries would record things in the night sky, but they had no idea what it was or where it came from. Now, of course, we call that astronomy. And like I was saying, our knowledge of the universe is growing all the time. So I look upon ufology as the same type of thing. It's only, it's not even 100 years old. If we go back to the benchmark that people use with Kenneth Arnold in 1947, mm-hmm. We haven't been studying this subject for 100 years yet. Some people think, well, 100 years, you should know by now. But if you look at things like astronomy, and you mentioned archaeology, they took an awful long time to become an accepted science. Yeah. Mm-hmm. If you think about some of the early dinosaur hunters, they were looked upon as kooks and cranks, and they would dig up some bones and they would put them back together again and get them wrong. So well, I think we're still in that learning stage of ufology, like the early archaeologists were, for example.
Yes. Well, even current day paleontology, as they discover ancient bone fragments of what they think are hominids, they don't really know exactly how to, extrapolate and build out that structure of the skeletal structure, right? They just have bits and pieces of bones, and there's a level of speculation as to what that thing is. And that's kind of how I feel like ufology is. We have these bits and pieces that we're kind of grasping at, but we haven't put the puzzle together yet.
Well, yeah, and of course, we don't have anything we can put under the microscope. I can't give you a piece of a flying saucer. They just don't exist. But we have to remember, we don't investigate reports of we don't investigate UFOs. We investigate sightings of UFOs.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of those sightings, we must remember, have a conventional explanation. Even if you can't find it, you can be pretty sure with a lot of things that there's an explanation behind it. And there's only a small percentage that at the end of the day leaves us scratching our heads. And it is perhaps smaller than some people would agree. I think it's a very small percentage. Yeah. But nonetheless, you only need the one. You only need one sighting to be unidentified to have something that's worthy of study.
Is there one UFO event that you think is the most credible?
There's a few. Well, I used this argument recently. I've been working with abductee called Calvin Parker.
Mm-hmm.
Calvin and Charles Hickson had their encounter at Pascagoula, Mississippi on October the 11th, 1973.
Yes.
They were fishing on the Pascagoula River. Calvin was only 19 at the time. His colleague Charles Hickson was 42. They had an encounter. They reported it to the police, and it became a big thing in its time. But it died away. Charlie passed away. Mm-hmm. Calvin never told his story in full until a couple of years ago, when I persuaded him to publish a book. What happened was, where the incident took place, Alan, is right next to Highway 90 in Pascagoula. So this is not the middle of nowhere. They could drive up to the location almost, which is what they did that night. Mm-hmm. And Charles Hickson wrote a book in 1983. And in that book, there are a couple of other witnesses. So when Calvin released his book, one of the things we thought about was maybe we could get one or two people to come forward. And much to our surprise and amazement, Calvin did some local media, local television, and people started to come out of the woodwork.
What year was this? The same year or years later?
Well, this is years later. This is when he published the book, a couple of years back. For example, when he'd done this little sort of 8-minute television show, somebody put it on YouTube. And one of the comments on it was, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night in 1973, and they too saw the UFO. So I contacted this lady. She told me who her mum and dad were. I asked if I could speak to them. She gave me their names. It was Mr. and Mrs. Blair. I spoke to them, and what they told me was Mr. Blair worked in the fishing industry, and he was waiting for a boat to come in, and it was late. So he was having a sleep in the back of the car. Mrs. Blair was outside on a little jetty, and what Calvin and Charlie saw initially was these dazzling blue lights. And Mrs. Blair said, I could see this blue light over the opposite side of the river. She said it seemed as if it was lost or if it was looking for something.
Interesting.
And then Mr. Blair got out of the car. He saw it. And then the boat started to come in. So they walked along this little pier. Mm-hmm. In the water next to them was a huge splash. And Mrs. Blair looked down and she says, in the water was a grey man. And she said he went under the water and didn't come back up.
Did they just see the splash? Did they not see anyone falling down?
No. Well, it was pitch black. You just heard a splash in the water next to them.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Mr. Blair said, I saw the blue light, but I didn't see this thing in the water. About a year later, Mr. Blair took ill. And he wanted to speak to me. And he literally spoke to me from the hospital. So I have to tell you, Philip, I saw the humanoid as well. I never admitted it because I didn't want people to think we were nuts. And he said it came up out of the water, went back across the river, and I saw the UFO take off. And sadly, Mr. Blair died not long after. So we wanted to get this off his chest before he passed away.
Sure, yeah.
And Mrs. Blair says, we never said anything to anybody. We told our two children, our two daughters. Mm-hmm. That was one of them who had made that comment on YouTube. And we saw the incident the next day on the local news with Charlie and Calvin. And she said, I've often wondered if something similar didn't happen to us. But they kept it quiet to themselves and their immediate family only. That's one. Lots of other people have come forward since, Alan.
This night or different nights?
Well, some a couple of nights before, some a few nights after, but the bulk of them on the exact night, October the 11th, 1973.
For those who are not familiar with Calvin and Charles' perspective, their experience. Can you remind them what that is?
So what it was, Calvin knew Charlie's son. They're grown up together. Calvin was getting married. He actually lived 200 miles away in Laurel. But he had like 2 or 3 jobs. He was never at home. So his father said, well, I'll ring Charlie at the shipyard. Maybe he can get you a steady job, a 9 to 5. So he did. And Calvin was a welder. The first part of the day on the job, he did some safety training. And then in the afternoon, he was welding. The one thing the two men did share was an interest and a hobby of fishing. So Calvin's got a new car. He's driving home that night. And Charlie says, you want to do some fishing? Oh, yeah, why not? Yeah, great. I've got no tackle. That's no problem. I got plenty. So they went and got the tackle. They stopped off for some bait.
Yeah.
They're pulling into the fishing spot. They passed another car with a how can we say it, a courting couple in it, kissing and cuddling. And then they passed a no entry sign. And Calvin didn't like that. He says to Charlie, we shouldn't be here. He says, don't worry about it.
So a regular spot for him?
Yeah, he knew it. So they're fishing at one place, but this place was infested with mosquitoes or bugs. So they moved to an old abandoned pier. There'd been a little shipyard there, and this thing was falling apart. So that's it. They're on a little pier out in the water. Calvin's facing the water. Out of nowhere, he sees some blue lights behind him, and he thinks, we're going to get arrested. I knew we shouldn't have ignored that no entry sign. He turns around and he sees Charlie's looking in the direction. He says, these dazzling blue lights. And they could see this thing descending. It was like an American football or rugby ball shaped.
Okay.
Lights at one end. And it stopped just a couple of feet off the ground. Didn't quite hit the ground. Calvin's immediate reaction was to try and run, but there was nowhere to run to. There was only water behind them. And on the other end, this opening appeared and more of this dazzling light came out. Kind of reminded Calvin of a welder's light, you can see it in the distance. And 3 figures came out of this opening. They were humanoid, but they had no eyes, no mouth. They had spiky protrusions out the side of their head, one out the front. Their legs didn't move. They didn't walk. They hovered. And they had mitten or pincer-like appendages on the end of their arms. Their skin was said to be grey, very wrinkly, like an elephant's skin, they described it.
Description, wrinkly.
Yeah. 2 got a hold of Charlie. 1 got a hold of Calvin. Calvin was terrified. And then he said, all of a sudden I felt this prick. And I suddenly became relaxed. And he said, we were literally floated into this thing. Once inside, he lost sight of Charlie. He said, I was taken to this room. I was put on this transparent table at an angle. I was clamped. And he said this thing came out of the ceiling about the size of a pack of cards and seemed to go around him, making a funny clicking noise.
Right.
And he said, again, I couldn't move. I was totally paralyzed. He said, the only thing I could move was my eyes. And then he said, this creature got hold of me again. Again, I was terrified. I felt like a prick, and it kind of relaxed me. And we were taken back onto the pier. And I came around, and Charlie's shouting at me, saying, are you all right, son? Are you all right? Are you all right? And then, poof, this thing went. It was gone. They had a discussion about what to do. Calvin says, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. He was literally off his head.
All right, well, let's hold it here, and we'll continue the story on the other side of the break. If you want to find out more about Philip Mantle, go to flyingdiscpress.blogspot.com. We'll be back on the other side. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on KGRA DB Radio. And if you want to find out more about upcoming programs and all of the great KGRA shows, go to kgradb.com. All right, we will see you on Flipside.
Not try to capture how I feel and tell you the whole truth, but there's too much to be said, so I just leave you small clues, but now I'm bearing my soul.
mainstream media's most wanted. KGRAradio.com.
You're lost in a bad way, starting to let go, gone too far the wrong way, can take it all back now. You're lost in a bad way, I've gotta let you go. You're supposed to be so close to me, you're mostly that close to me, yeah.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith. With me tonight is Philip Mantle. Philip, so we left the story of Calvin Parker after the UFO had departed, left them behind, and they were going to have a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, Charlie and Calvin discussed this. I mean, like I said, Calvin was extremely distressed. So they decided, okay, we won't tell anyone. You know, nobody, who's going to believe us anyway? So they made their way back to Calvin's car. Remember, I said it was brand new. Now, as they got there, they opened the door and the passenger window just was shattered and fell out.
Sure.
They got in. The car wouldn't start. Took them a while to get it to go, couldn't figure that out because it was brand new. So they set off, and Charlie had a change of heart. He said, no, we better tell somebody. Charlie had been in the military and had fought in the Korean War. And he said, you know, what if this is some kind of attack or whatever? Or they could grab somebody else. So they stopped at a payphone, and Charlie first phoned the Air Force base at Keesler, which wasn't that far away. A lady answered, and she just said, we don't investigate UFOs anymore. Call the local authorities. So they did. They phoned the police. They said, where are you? We'll come and get you. So it was actually the sheriff's department that came out, gave them a sobriety test to begin with, then escorted them into Pascagoula, took them to the sheriff's department, and they interviewed both guys separately. It was Sheriff Fred Diamond, and one of his deputies was Glenn Ryder. And they told him the whole story. What Charlie and Calvin had decided to do, as far as Calvin was concerned, was to say at the moment the creatures got hold of him that he'd passed out. So he didn't remember anything. It was to try and protect his young colleague.
Yeah.
So the police thought something not right here. So what they did, they put them both in a room together with a table next to them. They opened the drawer, closed the drawer, and they left Charlie and Calvin in the room on their own. What they didn't know is in the table was a tape recorder playing. So after 5 or 6 minutes, the deputy came back in, went in the drawer, and they didn't see what he was doing. He was actually recovering the tape.
Yeah.
They thought, we'll have them now, you know. So they played the tape, and of course they didn't. They were still talking about what had happened. Calvin was extremely distressed. He was even saying a prayer at one point, and Charlie's saying, I'll look after your son, you know. This became known as the secret tape.
Right. Yeah.
So the sheriff said, look, guys, you better go home. There's nothing we can do. So they said, well, please, Sheriff, don't tell anyone. And he said, no, we won't. So they went home, decided we'll just get up in the morning and go to work. But in mind, Calvin had only been on the job for one day. And as they're driving into the shipyard the next morning, they noticed there was an awful lot of cars there compared to what there normally was. And when they got there, it was the media. Somehow the story had got out. They were literally mobbed by the media. Their boss was none too happy, to say the least. Cutting a long story short, they went to the local hospital to be checked. They were fine. They were even sent to Keesler Air Force Base, which they'd first phoned, to be checked for radiation, which was negative.
Okay.
The officials at Keesler said, oh, by the way, guys, while you're here, perhaps you'll tell us what happened, which is a bit ironic, seeing as that was the first place they'd phoned.
Right.
So they did. They still kept the story up that Calvin had passed out. Within no time at all, Dr. Alan Hynek Project Blue Book fame, and Dr. James Harder from APRO were on site, interviewed the gentleman, also listened to the secret tape, which Charlie and Calvin still weren't aware of. Dr. Harder tried to hypnotize both guys. He tried Calvin, and it was just a waste of time. He was so distressed. He managed to hypnotize Charlie. And before they left, Hynek held a press conference and said, something genuine has happened to these two gentlemen. Please treat them with respect. And off they went. Now, Calvin just wanted none of it. He went back home to Laurel, like I said, 200 miles away. But Charlie would continue to speak about it. He was more than happy. He went on the Dick Cavett talk show. 3 weeks after the event, Calvin ended up in hospital with a kind of a breakdown. And that's the way the years went by. Charlie would speak about it every now and again. Calvin would occasionally come out of the woodwork at Charlie's behest, but he didn't want anything to do with it. So it was a case I read about in the 1980s, and I've always been fascinated by it. And when I started flying this press, I managed to get hold of a copy of Charles Hickson's book that he wrote with a guy called William Mendez. It's called, UFO Contact in Pascagoula. And I knew that Charles Hickson had passed away, and I'd got permission to reprint this book. I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I could find Calvin and just get an interview with him? And I was amazed. A lot of people had never heard of it. So it took me about 3 months when I finally got an email for Calvin, and he replied. So he gave me a phone number, and I spoke to him, and he was very polite. Didn't tell me an awful lot. Unbeknown to me, just a few months before I popped up, Calvin and his wife, Wynette, had been to a friend's funeral. And on the way out of the church, I don't know if they signed a book of condolence or whatever, but Calvin signed his name. And people behind him, when they saw his name, they were sort of pointing and winking and nodding, Calvin, first of all, thought that was disrespectful. But his wife went and said, well, why don't you tell the story? Why don't you write a book? So Calvin, just to pacify his wife, said, yeah, I might do that. And he made some notes and whatever. So I didn't approach him to write a book. It just came up in the conversation. And so before we knew it, we'd agreed to do it.
So he was already kind of taking notes and preparing for a book when you contacted him?
I don't think he had any intention of writing a book. This was just to pacify his wife, make it look like he was. He sent me the notes and they were just nothing,
Why wouldn't he want to write about it?
Well, Calvin had spent all his life running away from it, and he wanted to leave it that way. I don't know if you can remember the old TV series of The Hulk.
Yes.
Faringa. Well, he used to run from town to town to get away from the journalist that was chasing him. Well, Calvin was hounded by journalists for years, and he literally did move from town to town. He even changed his name at one point, and it scared the living daylights out of him. But somehow he agreed to write a book, so we did. And he told his story in full for the first time. Of course, he didn't pass out. He saw, what happened on board. So he told the whole story. Keesler Air Force Base, for example, when they went there, we found that there was a transcript of that meeting. So it wasn't recorded. They had a stenographer. So we got the whole transcript of their discussions at Keesler Air Force Base, along with all the people that were there. They're all named.
Was that to get that transcript, or was it a simple request?
It just turned up in a file. Calvin had no paperwork, no photographs. He lost everything in Hurricane Katrina. So while he's writing the book and I'm helping him edit it, I set about to see what other information we could find. And it was alleged to be Hynek's favorite case, so I was looking for letters from Hynek and files. So I just sent a blanket request out to anybody and everybody who was around about that time. Mm-hmm. And they all helped. We also found in the Hynex Center for UFO Studies file on Pascagoula a typewritten letter. And you could tell it's done on the old typewriter because the date was done wrong. So they've gone back and typed over it. So you can see the two dates.
Yeah.
And it's just a one-page document. And it's a medical examination of both guys. And it said they found puncture wounds on them. Mm-hmm. Bearing in mind, Calvin said he felt a prick on his arm when he was very agitated.
Yeah, were these medical reports given to them at the time?
No, Calvin had never seen it, never knew this existed. And
who inspected him? Was it the police or?
Well, he was examined by Dr. James Harder, who wasn't a medical doctor, but he was also examined by the local hospital.
Okay, so local people were involved. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And he'd never seen it. We also got the secret tape. It's online, but we got a cleaned up version of it. So we had the transcript of the secret tape. Mm-hmm. And Calvin told me that other things had happened. So we wrote the book. It actually became a bestseller on Amazon, much to our amazement. It just rocketed. Then other people started coming forward, like I explained, the Mr. and Mrs. Blair. They were one of many. And Calvin said, well, I had another episode 20 years later. He said in 1993, I think he said March. He doesn't know the exact date. Mm-hmm. He went fishing on his own, this time in a little boat. And he said, I was only supposed to be gone for a couple of hours, so I just took a sandwich and a bottle of water. And he said, I'm out in the river, and I look up, and there's this cloud. And he said, all I can remember is the cloud opened. It wasn't a cloud. Next thing he remembers, it's dark. And he goes back to shore. His car is parked there, but underneath his windscreen wiper is a little note from his wife. Where are you? Been looking for you. Because he was late. She'd gone looking for him and left him a note.
Yeah.
He was covered in muck. He had other little memories. He went home and just told his wife that the engine had broke down on the boat. Again, moving forward in time a little bit, he had a friend who was partially interested in UFOs. Mm-hmm. And he told his friend about what had happened. He said, the guy you want to see about this is Bud Hopkins. Anybody who knows, Bud was, the best known abduction researcher, probably still is, although he's sadly no longer with us. Just so happened, Bud was speaking at a UFO convention in Florida. So Calvin and his friend got in the car, drove to Florida, unannounced, got a hotel room, and he sent his friend into the conference to speak to Bud. Well, Bud, being such a nice guy, says, I'll see him in my hotel room at whatever time. So they met and they had a chat, and Bud says, do you want to undergo hypnosis? Calvin says, I don't like that hypnosis stuff. You're playing with my mind. It's nothing like that. It's nothing. So he put him under hypnosis. Calvin thought he was under hypnosis for about 5 or 10 minutes. Didn't remember much, if anything. And so, of course, Bud has since passed away. But his archive was held, and still is, by Dr. David Jacobs, another well-known abduction researcher. So I contacted David with Calvin's permission and said, can you find the tape of that session? And he did. And he sent me a copy. And much to our amazement, Calvin talked about 2 little encounters when he was a young kid, then the one in 1973, and then the one in 1993. And the full-blown abduction came out. What came out amongst all 4 encounters, Calvin also saw this female creature. And it was the same one down the years.
Down the years, in each of these events?
Yeah. And
So when he was with Charlie, he saw the same woman or female creature.
Charlie never mentioned it. Charlie never mentioned that in his book at all.
Okay.
And we can't ask him because he's passed away. However, Charlie also did mention a couple of childhood encounters and another UFO sighting some years after the event. So in the 1993 encounter, again, Calvin's on this thing. This woman says she looks pretty much like us, but she has an extended, long, thin middle finger. She's putting this down his nose. And he was bleeding. And he said, I've had enough of this. He said, I'm going to kill her.
Yeah.
Bear in mind, he can't move, but she sort of disappears a little bit, and he starts to come around, and he breaks free. And he said, I got hold of her, and I'm bashing her head against the wall. And she had some kind of mask on. And, of course, the other creature got hold of him, and that was the end of it.
Sure.
There's a lot more to the story, Alan. It's longer and complicated.
You know, that's quite an interesting story, because oftentimes when we hear people referring to beings of the opposite sex, oftentimes, not always, there is a sexual characteristic to their experience. And in this case, it's quite not at all. And there's an aggression there. There's an anger.
Said I wanted to get hold of her, and if there was a door available, she was going out the door with me, whether we're 1 foot off the ground or 1,000 feet off the ground. I had enough, you know. And he meant it. And
unlike Travis Walton, you know, he woke up in a panic on this ship, apparent ship, and saw people around him, and he tried to get off, and he grabbed some kind of cylindrical piece and started swinging it at them because he went into panic mode and survival mode.
Yeah.
It's really understandable.
So we decided to write a second book and publish this. I also found out that Charles Hickson had also been to see Bud Hopkins in the 1980s. So I managed to get the 2 tapes of that and transcribe them. We were very fortunate that you mentioned the lady earlier on called Kathy Marden. Mm-hmm. She was able to visit Calvin in September 2019 and also place him under hypnosis. So we had her work to transcribe as well. And we put all this in a second book, along with some of the new witnesses and more documents that we'd found and things of that nature. And it's become a big story all over again, but not with the sort of media frenzy that did first time around.
He mentioned a cloud in this, I think, the 93 event.
Yeah.
The cloud that he saw, I remember reading about a case where someone witnessed a cloud, but it was kind of angular, like it had an odd shape. Was this just like a puff of mist? How does he describe
the cloud? And he said it opened. The cloud opened. And even though he had a period of missing time, he had a few little flashbacks that something had happened. Mm-hmm. I mean, for example, when he woke up, or when he came round, call it what you will, he'd eaten his sandwich and drank his water. No recollection of that. And he told his friend, I didn't catch any fish. He said, well, what's all these in the bucket? He didn't even remember catching any fish, which for a fisherman, they may exaggerate how many they've caught, but they still remember catching some, And some more witnesses came forward. I mean, people criticized both guys because where they were, the bridge goes right over the river with all the traffic. Mm-hmm. Somebody said, well, surely somebody in the traffic would have seen it. Well, a gentleman did come forward. We have interviewed him. And he said, I was driving over the bridge with my wife. And he said, I see the blue light down below me, thinking, I thought it was an airplane going to crash. It was that low.
Yeah.
The next day, he went to visit his aunt who lived down by the river. And he said, before I can open my mouth, she says, you'll never guess what I thought last night. And we had another gentleman called Louis Lee, who was on the other side of the river that night working in one of the shipyards. Mm-hmm. He was a crane operator. And he said, Philip, the cab of my crane was about 10 or 12 feet off the ground. As soon as I got in it, I could see this this blue thing over the river.
Yeah.
This is the most beautiful thing you've ever seen.
Wait,
He said, I was watching it for about 10 minutes. He said, the only reason I took my eyes off it is because I had a load on the end of my crane. My colleagues shouting, what are you doing? You know? He said, and when I turned back, it had gone. So these were just examples, Alan. There are more than that, but these are just examples.
Yeah, these blue lights you described as beautiful or as dazzling, right? Do we know what they were? Was it just a sparkly kind of light? Like what other descriptives are there out there?
Calvin just said it was a dazzling blue light that hurt your eyes to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And he said it took a while for your eyes to get used to the light.
Yeah.
He said at first we couldn't make out the shape of the thing that was emitting the light. And he said when you went inside the walls, he called it the paint. He says the light just came out of the paintwork. There was no paint. It just came out of the walls. And Calvin was when you actually hear the secret tape, they're amazed how this opening appears. There's no door opens or anything. It just appears. And they're stunned by it, you know?
Yeah.
And so Calvin has laid everything out. It's all there. We got some more information about Charlie with the 2 transcripts he did with Bud.
Mm-hmm.
And we decided we'll print it in full. So it was kind of funny because when I got the tape. So you've got Calvin Parker with his Mississippi accent. As you might hear from my accent, I have a North of England accent. Then I had Bud Hopkins with his New York accent, and I'm trying to figure out what they're trying to say, you know. And there are certain, although we both speak English, there is differences between our 2 versions of English. For example, this is an interesting part of the story. Calvin says, as we're driving in, back in 1973, we passed this other car, if you remember. There was a courting couple in it. He said it was a red whatever with a such and such tag on it. What's the tag? So I had to ask him. He says, the tag tells you which state it comes from. We don't have that in the UK. You just have a number plate and that's it. Okay. However, under hypnosis, Calvin could actually read the number plate of the car. Wow. So he remembered it. So a few years later, what Calvin did, he hired someone to try and find the owners of that car in 1973. And they did. They found the man first, but he sadly passed away. They found the woman who was still alive.
Right.
As Calvin describes it, almost like a movie. He said, this thing's coming down. And I could see their car driving away. And he sort of locked eyes with the lady in the back window. And he managed to find her. And she just got into a nursing home. Still had all the marbles about her. She was just getting old. And she only agreed to speak to Calvin on one condition, and that was he kept her name out of it. And okay. She told me she saw the UFO lift off as they were driving away.
So in the future, is there any way to validate this other person who owned the car?
I don't think we'll be able to validate that lady. But I mean, Calvin hasn't kept in touch. She may well have passed away now.
Okay.
But we don't really need to because we have so many others who've come forward. None of which know each other. They're all from in and around. Now, what is also interesting, Alan, this happened on October the 11th, 1973. On November the 6th, 1973, so we're talking about 3 weeks later, 2 little boats go out on the Pascagoula River, a bit further out from where Charlie and Calvin were because they were on the bank of the river. There's 9 people in these 2 boats. They're called little skiffs. And they're fishing. It's dark, you know.
Yeah.
And they spot something under the water. It's circular. It's a whitish colour.
Mm-hmm.
And he said it was separated with segments, a bit like you look down on an old-fashioned parachute where there were segments in them. So the boat catches up with this illuminated object, gets an oar, bump, and manages to hit it.
Wow.
The lights would go out and it would appear somewhere else in the water. So they played cat and mouse with it for about half an hour or so.
Wow.
Enough of this, they went in person to the Coast Guard station and reported it. The Coast Guard sent a boat out and they also saw it. And they also managed to hit it. Now, the Coast Guard made a full report. We managed to get the documents from the Coast Guard, and it mentioned all the witnesses. But it mentioned in the report that they'd taken a photograph of these witnesses. A colleague of mine in the States happened to have that photograph. Mm-hmm. It's in colour, so you've got these 9 people lined up on the bank, and it's all in colour. When you turn the photograph over, there's their names and all their ages. Mm. So I put that on social media. Within a couple of hours, we had people contacting us saying, I know who that is. He's dead. Turned out that 8 of the 9 people had passed away. There was one left. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but we managed to get a contact and a phone number. And we have phoned him. I work with a colleague by the name of Dr. Irina Scott in the United States, and Irina has interviewed him on tape, and we have a transcript of that interview. So things were even seen afterwards. This gentleman told us, he said, the Navy came out the next day. The Navy sent a guy, mm-hmm. and he asked me where it happened. He said, I showed him. It's just water. There was nothing to see it. It was just the water.
So no diver was sent?
No, he just said that the Navy guy asked me what had happened. I told him. I showed him where it took place. So things were happening. And what we have to remember as well, when you look a bit wider, there was a huge wave of sightings across the United States in 1973. Mm-hmm. October was the peak of those sightings. And right in amongst it was the events with Hickson and Parker at Pascagoula. So he asked me earlier on if there was one case, this would be the one. I would hazard a guess, if we took this case to court, we could prove that something had happened that night. Not exactly what had happened, but we could prove beyond reasonable doubt that something strange had happened to Hickson and Parker, simply because of the documentation we have, the tape recordings from the police, the other eyewitnesses, and so on.
That begs the question, how much of their story do you believe?
I have no reason to disbelieve any of it.
So if that's the case, how do you look at a case like this and think this is human activity, that the UFO or something?
I'm not saying it's human activity. All I'm saying is I believe that something quite extraordinary happened to these 2 gentlemen that night. Yeah. And I can't find a rational explanation for it.
And what about this being that was witnessed falling into the water?
Yeah.
Were there any other eyewitness accounts of seeing beings outside of the ship?
No, Mr. and Mrs. Blair are the only ones. Again, I have a little video of Mr. Blair that he made in hospital.
Okay.
Extremely ill. With
that's really
hanging from him.
That's very important. In speaking to the Aztec UFO case, I don't know if you're familiar with that, in New Mexico. Yeah. The Ramseys, when I was speaking to them, I had asked, they had, I guess in the early 2000s, found apparently witnesses of that case and interviewed them on paper. But I asked, did you interview them on video? And they said, no, regretfully, we wish we would have done that, because it does mean it does add that much more credence to a story. Like the Roswell event, right? In '89, when that episode of Unsolved Mysteries came out, and we saw those real human beings talking about it.
Yeah. Well, Mrs. Blair has been on local television to mention some of it, but there's more to the story. Mr. Blair, before he died, told his wife that he thought they had been abducted as well. But he sadly passed away. Mrs. Blair is willing to undergo regressive hypnosis. And that may happen at some point in the future. we shall see. But I believe the gentleman in question, both Charlie and what I did find in our search for information, Alan, just to show that we weren't biased. At the time, the arch skeptic used to be a gentleman called Philip Klass. He's no longer with us, but Philip was the arch debunker. I met Philip and spoke to him in person in America, and he got hot on the trail, and he had a full case file on it, which I have accessed. And even in Calvin's second book, I publish an unpublished article that Philip wrote about the case. And he basically dismisses it as a hoax. But when you look through his case file, he can't, there's no proof there that it is a hoax. He couldn't find it. He was looking to dig up dirt on the two guys, and he couldn't find it.
Yeah, that was his MO, right? He was always looking to get somebody to look guilty, to dig up some kind of dirt, to entrap them in some kind of a statement. I mean, it was really undermined.
Well, I'll give you an example. Again, in Calvin's second book, he got persuaded by Charlie to do a TV show with him.
You know what, Philip, hold that thought. We're going to go to the second break.
Okay.
We'll come right back on the other side. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on KGRA Radio. Thank you all for tuning in with us tonight. If you want to find out more about Philip Mantle, flyingdiscpress.com. flyingdiscpress.blogspot.com. And when we get back on the other side, we'll continue this story and so much more. I've many more questions for Philip about some other cases as well. I will see you on the flip side.
Mainstream media's most wanted. KGRAradio.com.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith, your grateful host. Taking us out of the break was music by Septembrio. If you want to find out more about Septembrio and their music, go to Septembrio, spelled with a Y.com. All right, we're back with Philip Mantle. And Philip, beyond this case, I do have many questions for you about some other cases that I think are utterly fascinating and insightful in the search for extraterrestrial proof or just proof that UFOs are a thing. But let's continue where we left off, and we'll wrap up the past.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Calvin was persuaded by Charlie to do a TV show. So he flew out to wherever. When he got there, it had been cancelled. And there was a journalist who was involved in it in some respect. And so Calvin was, well, why was it cancelled? He said, well, there's another guy called Philip Klass. He's refused to go on with you two. So Calvin had never heard this name, Philip Klass, and no idea who it was. So the journalist tries to, settle things down. So he said, look, I'll buy all three of you dinner. So they go across the road to a diner, and by this time, Charlie and Philip Klass are just not speaking to each other. And so they sit down, and so the journalist asked Philip Klass, why wouldn't you go on television with these two gentlemen? Mm-hmm. And he says, because they're liars. Now, Calvin had no objection to people not believing them, but to call him a liar was something entirely different.
Sure.
So he got up from the table and he told Mr. Class in no uncertain terms that if he called him a liar again, what he might do to him, and said, "Come on, Charlie, that's us finished." So they got back on the airplane and went home, because that's the kind of guy Calvin was. I don't mind if you don't believe me, he says, but I'm not a liar.
Yeah.
So I would recommend his 2 books if anybody is interested: Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter, and Pascagoula, The Story Continues.
Well, Philip, you have written so much. If you just go to Amazon and put in Philip Mantle, the number of books that come up, it's just astounding. Is this what you do full time? Is this your life's passion?
Yeah. I used to work in industry. And then in 1999, I took ill, so I had to pack in industry.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up going totally the opposite way and working for a bank. I do apologize, but I got the chance to take early retirement, so I did. And I set up Flying This Press. And the idea behind Flying This Press is to publish books, not just my own, but from others around the world, wherever I can. So I have published books from Poland, Romania, Brazil, Japan, Italy. We've also set up Flying This Press in France. So some of our books make it into French, and we've set it up in Latin America. So some of them end up in Spanish as well. And of course, I write all the time. My latest book is called Introducing UFOs, A Young Person's Guide. I wrote that, published it earlier this year. It's illustrated by Ronald Kinsella. I have another book coming out at some point that's called UFO Landings UK. Speaks for itself, I think.
I think so.
Excuse me.
There are landings and then there are USOs, right?
Yeah.
So, like in this case and in many other cases, there are witnesses that describe UFOs going underwater into a lake. We hear that in the Hudson Valley up here in New York often, or in the ocean. So is a USO really just an amphibian UFO?
Well, it's a good question. Again, if we go back to what we've just been talking about, Pascagoula, they saw things under the water and reported it to the Coast Guard. We also have another sighting from the mouth of the Pascagoula River in daylight by a gentleman working on one of the ships. And he said, when you're not in the shipyard and working on the ship, you're quite high up. You get a good view down. And he said, we saw these 4 things go out under the water and we saw them come back in again.
Yeah.
I've worked with a colleague.
What's going on there? What do you think? What's the behavior tell you?
Well, I work with a colleague in the States called Paul Stonehill. Mm-hmm. Paul is originally from the Ukraine, and he escaped the Ukraine when it was still part of the Soviet Union. And I do mean escape. And he was on the KGB wanted list at one point because he helped others get out of the old Soviet Union. And back in the late 1980s, there was a big case that happened in a place called Voronezh in Russia. And it was a UFO landing case. There were tall beings described, left marks behind on the ground. This incident was released by the Soviet news agency, TASS. So it's the official Soviet news agency. And the British media said, are you joking? And they just said, we don't joke. Now, at the time I was with the British UFO Research Association, I got a call from a Russian newspaper. It was called Izvestia, and it was a national newspaper. And they asked me what I thought about this. Well, I didn't know any more than I'd read in the newspaper. Mm-hmm. But anyway, they printed it, and they sent me a copy. And the only thing I could understand was my name, obviously. But much to my surprise, letters started arriving from Russia. And it just said, Philip Mantle. The town where I lived at that point was called Batley. It said, Batley, UFOs, England. no street, no nothing. And lots of letters, all in Russian. Books started arriving. I got a few letters from Russian UFO researchers that were in English. I was able to respond. And they just kept piling up. And I thought, well, I don't know what to do with this stuff. I found out about Paul. I contacted Paul. And I said, look, most of this stuff's in Russian. I don't know. He said, well, send me it. I said, there's a good bit of stuff. So he gave me his FedEx account, and I sent it to him, and he just said, oh, my, he didn't quite use those words, oh, my, but it was something along those lines. So we began working together because he could read and write Russian, of course. He was able to translate this. And one of the things we started to work on was USOs. In other words, UFOs seen under the water. And we worked with a lot of colleagues across what was the Soviet Union. And, for example, I also used to be a conference organizer here in the UK. The only two Russian scientists ever to lecture about UFOs in the UK were at one of my conferences, and they helped us, find some contacts. Once the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Empire bit the dust, and then the internet came along, of course, it made it a lot easier. Still have the problem of the language barrier from time to time, because although Paul can read and write Russian, he has to earn a living, so he can't spend all day reading stuff in Russian, So it's a fascinating look. And of course, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of attention on these sort of so-called USOs because of the US Navy video that have been released, claiming some of these were seen underwater before taking off. One of the biggest lakes in the world is Lake Baikal in Russia, and things have been seen under the water there. So it's something we keep an interest in, and we may do some more on it in the future.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. So if we go back in time a little bit, the To the Stars Academy, in tandem with ATIP, that whole story. What's your take on that? Was this really just someone who had an interest in UFOs, had the means to start an organization, or is this a slow disclosure of some sort? And Tom DeLonge is kind of just being allowed to be used in a way to disseminate information.
It's a good question, Alan. I mean, what I would say regarding disclosure, I've heard of disclosure in different guises since the day I first set foot in ufology. And for example, in the 1980s, they had Operation Right to Know, where they would literally march outside the White House with banners. And they were convinced that the government, whoever the government is, them are going to release the information. Today, it just has a different name, and they now call it disclosure. Personally, I don't hold your breath over it. It goes round in cycles, of about 8 or 10 years.
Yeah.
So I'm sure in another 10 years' time they'll call it something else, and it'll be the government. Well, you have to remember that the government is not necessarily your elected officials.
Yeah.
The government are the civil servants that are there all the time. The elected officials come and go, as we know. We get fed up with them, we vote them out.
Yeah.
People behind the scenes remain the same and have a great influence on government policy and so on. What is interesting about the, we'll call it the Tic Tac video and so on, is that nobody knew they were there. They literally came out of the blue. There was no drip effect saying there's something coming. I think a lot of people were surprised when they saw it in the New York Times, December 2017. But it promised a lot more, and it hasn't delivered anything else since then. Yes, some of the eyewitnesses are being found, and it has, done some good in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
But you kind of think, well, where's the rest of it? I think the US spent, I don't know, $20 or $30 million on that particular program. Well, if all you've got for it is 3 videos for $20 or $30 million, it's not a very good return, I don't think. Where's the rest of it?
Yes, I mean, there are other, endeavors that TTA is.
Yeah.
TTSA.
I mean, well, don't get me wrong. I have nothing against them. I wish them well. And if you think about it, Tom DeLonge's an unlikely candidate to be involved in such a thing. But why not? Why not?
I think it's fun. It is. Even shows like this. It's infotainment to a degree. And that's kind of what Tom DeLonge, I think, has decided to do, is to pursue something that he's fascinated by and turn it into a business that includes information and entertainment, which is great. But has Lou Elizondo and, in tandem with TTSA, actually changed the narrative? And I would say yes, because, you have the Navy officiating that these are real UFOs or UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. They're unknowns. And now we have the UFO Task Force, whatever that might turn out to be, whether it's a shallow attempt at understanding a phenomena just to appease some Congress people, or whether it's a legit investigation. I don't know, but I do feel like the narrative is being pushed forward so that mainstream is more accepting. Do you think that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement, Alan. Yes, and that has to be complemented as a result. Mm-hmm. But you go back to the 1990s, and a similar thing happened when Dr. John Mack stepped out of the shadows with his abduction research. He's a Harvard professor, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, going on the record and saying there is something to this subject. So again, that air of credibility also peaks and troughs. You
have Hal Puthoff, you have Dr. Eric Davis over the years. These are legitimate scientists that have looked into paranormal. Bigelow, right? He's been investigating this for forever. And in our community, I think we tend to get more excited about these investigations than the public because they don't have the same sort of perspective we do, I think.
I often remind people that the term close encounters wasn't invented by Steven Spielberg. It was Dr. Alan Hynek, a UFO researcher.
The government, essentially.
Same with UAPs. They weren't invented by the US Navy. We've been using it here in the UK on and off for decades.
Yeah.
So it's nothing new. They've just adopted it.
Although my problem with UAP is it's much easier to say ufologist rather than apologist.
Well, we have to remember, they were called flying saucers. I don't know if it was Project Blue Book who came up with the phrase UFO, was to give it an air of credibility. So we have the modern equivalent of that now is UAP. And like I said, in 20, 30 years' time, they might come up with another acronym for it. They might call it something entirely different.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah, phenomena sounds a bit more amorphic and ambiguous. So, object sounds more literal. Right?
Well, I'll give you an example. In central Norway, there is a valley called Hessdalen. It's quite remote. There's only a few hundred people there. But in the early 1980s, the locals started to see these strange lights in the valley, surrounded by 3 mountains, but they were below the mountaintops. They were down in the valley. And the UFO groups of Norway and Sweden got together and formed Project Hessdalen. And they went there, of course, spoke to people. In the winter, it gets extremely cold there, and I'm talking very cold. And so what they did, they set up shop in a caravan there and a hut in sub-zero temperatures, but they wanted to get assistance from the universities and the military. Mm-hmm. So they never used the word UFO when approaching these people. They just talked about these unidentified lights.
Yeah.
And left it at that. And of course, they got the assistance they required from the university. The military even brought them tents and wood and things like that, to such an extent that there have been scientists attend workshops in Hessdalen from around the world. There is now a 24-hour monitoring field station there. The lights have been caught on video now. Initially, it was just on still camera, and it's even taught in the local schools. But when they started off, they didn't use when they were approaching officialdom, we'll call them officialdom or whoever that may be, they didn't use the term UFO, just called it unidentified lights, strange lights, and it got them what they wanted. So again, you adopt, I had an old colleague many years ago. He was a lovely guy called Hilary Evans, and he said, flying saucer is like a tin can tied to a cat's tail. And so it's you say flying saucer or UFO, people automatically think, oh, alien spaceship. Mm-hmm. So the phrase UFO is trying to give it that today's air of credibility. And like I say, it may change to something else, but that's the way it is.
Have you developed an instinct when talking to witnesses as to whether someone is telling the truth or not?
No, not at all.
No.
Not at all. I mean, I've been involved in a number of hoaxes down the years. I've uncovered them. And there were hoaxes for different reasons. One was a very big one, which is the alien autopsy film, of course. Mm-hmm. We've had a couple of others. We had a local guy who claimed, this will make you laugh. A chap wrote to me, and it's the days before the internet. So, mm-hmm. And it didn't live far from me. And he sent me a Polaroid photograph. He said he'd been walking across the field, taking his dog for a walk, and he encountered this alien. And he filmed it. So this is video film.
Yeah.
This is a still from it. I've frozen my TV screen, taken a photograph, and here it is. So you see this man stood like this, and you can see it's a mask because you can see the elastic going around his hair, pulling his hair in. So I thought, my initial reaction is just to throw it in the bin,
Sure.
Say I'll forget it. But I didn't. I was part of the British UFO Research Association. We had some lovely headed notepaper. So I wrote back to him saying, this is it. This is what we've all been waiting for. I'm going to notify the FBI, NASA, MI5, you name it. Mm-hmm. Amazing. Let me come and see this video. He wrote back and said, oh, I'm sorry, I taped over it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of tapes, you covered the autopsy, alien autopsy video. So where are you now on that? Well,
that's a fake. It's 100% hoax.
Okay. Yeah. Were you taken by it, though, in the beginning?
At the beginning, the beginning isn't where the people think the beginning is. Ray Santilli, the man behind it, mm-hmm. contacted me, again, in writing in 1993. He didn't write to me personally. He wrote to the British UFO Research Association. I was, among other things, I was their press officer. And he asked for our assistance in making a UFO documentary. So I wrote back saying we can do this, that, and the other. And we exchanged a couple of phone calls and a couple of faxes. And I'm talking to him about the documentary. And then he just changed the story, Alan. He said, well, actually, Philip, I've got film of the UFO crash at Roswell. And one of the creatures being autopsied. So I said, okay, show me. Now, he lived in London. I'm 200 miles north of London, but no big deal. Show me. Yes, I can. No, I can't. Yes, I can. No, I can't. Anyway, I'd organised an event in London, and Ray Santilli's office was nearby, so I invited him along. And he came, and I met him, and he told me about being out in the States. His main business was music. He claimed he met an old boy. He bought a piece of Elvis film from him. Mm-hmm. And this guy said, well, if you think that's good, I used to be in the military, and I filmed Roswell. Do you want to buy it? Cash, questions asked, no names. So I said, great story, show me it. Yes, I can, no, I can't. So I said, forget it. So we moved forward in time to 1995, and I was sent a movie for review, and it was Roswell. made by Paul Davids. It was a low volume VHS that was being released here. You just sent a review copy. Stars Kyle MacLachlan. And I thought, I wonder if that Santilli guy still claims to have film of Roswell. I got his business card.
Okay.
Pulled it out of the drawer. Phoned him. He says, yeah, but you don't believe me, Philip. I said, well, I can't believe you until you show me it. So he said, okay, make an appointment with my secretary and come on down, I'll show you it. So my wife and I drove to London, goes to his offices, and he puts the film in the VHS player and starts to show us it. Mm-hmm. So I could confirm now after 18 months that film did exist. And it was a dark film. And so I asked Ray Santilli, what do you plan to do with this? And he said, I'm going to make my documentary and I'm going to sell it myself. It'll go out in your local video store, Blockbuster it used to be, or Woolworths that was still open then, and or you'll be able to buy it direct from me. So I said, okay. And I just thinking on my feet, Alan, I said, I'm also UFO Conference Organiser. I've got a conference organised for August of this year. This is 1995. Will you show it at the conference? I thought if we get this film out into the public domain, we'll learn something about it.
So you had doubts then?
Well, I didn't have anything one way or the other.
Okay.
It was clear that Santilli had his own agenda. And what that was up to him. So he agreed to show it at the conference. In the meantime, the story got out by accident and it snowballed and went around the world. It then ended up on Fox television. And we showed it at the conference. So once it goes out on television in August 1995, I'm thinking, I'll just sit here now.
Oh, yeah.
Wait. But of course, nothing, Alan. And not anything. No one came forward one way or the other. No one came forward and said, that's me. I'm one of the actors. Mm-hmm. Or that's my studio. It was filmed in. Or alternatively, that was my grandfather. He told me all about this. This is amazing. I'm absolutely nothing. So, rightly or wrongly, I decided that in public and in private with Ray Santilli, I would support him. I would say, you can do it, Ray. Show him, what's what. But behind the scenes, I was just trying to find out what it was. I took it personally, Alan, because I was accused at one point by an idiot of being Ray Santilli's accomplice.
Yeah.
And at the time, for example, my wife and I were having an extension built on our house. And it was, well, where did Philip Mantle get the money from? He hasn't got that kind of money.
Oh,
well, it was true. I didn't, but my wife did.
Yeah.
She had her own property, which she'd sold, which we used some of the money of to build the extension. We got a young family starting to grow, so we needed a bit more room,
It's a false equivocation. Yeah.
So I remember sitting and having lunch in London with Santilli one day. So I'll get to the bottom of it one way or another. Right? And he just, that's fine, Philip. He wasn't offended. So, bit by bit, we'd chip away at it, and I got a few leads. And then it's a long story, Alan. It really is a long story. But I wrote a magazine article about it many years later. I mentioned him. He started the Yorkshire UFO Society, Graham Birdsall. Graham went on to publish what was called UFO magazine here in the UK. Very successful. So I wrote an article and he put it on the front cover. And a gentleman emailed me and said, is anybody still interested in the alien autopsy film? I said, yeah, why do you ask? He said, because my friend made the dummies for it. I grabbed my attention.
Yeah.
Well, I said, who's your friend? He said, well, is there any interest in it? And I'm saying, yeah. So I got a phone number for him. I phoned this guy. He gave me the name of Simon. I don't think that's his real name for a minute. Yeah. We arranged to meet at a location in Manchester. He picked the location, just a cafe. Mm-hmm. So I met. And strange thing about this cafe, it was one that was all glass. So all the way around you could see in it. I just thought, this is all a bit cloak and dagger. So he tells me, he said, my friend made the dummies for the alien autopsy film, and he's looking for a payday. Are there any television people interested? I said, well, the only one I know is a chap called Bob Kiviat. He made Alien Autopsy, fact or fiction, for Fox. Bob and I have kept in touch down the years. He may be interested. I'll give you his details. And he said, I said, well, tell me who you. So I can't tell you who he is. But he slipped up. He told us about a project that his friend had worked on in television. And it was on Channel 4 here in the UK. And it was called Max Headroom. Max Headroom was basically a head and shoulders dummy that talked. It was a comedy show. And I managed to find out who the guy was that made it. Now, we'd been looking for a special effects guy. Turned out that the man that made Max Headroom was a sculptor whose work on occasions overlapped into the film and television business. So it wasn't a special effects guy per se. And so Bob Kiviat is talking to this John Humphreys, that's his name, UK sculptor, trained at the Royal Academy. And everything was going fine. And then he just said, I'm not talking to you anymore. And he came out with a name. He says, it's Spiros you need to speak to. The reason that John had stopped talking at that point was Ray Santilli had signed to do a movie called Alien Autopsy. Guess what? John was going to do the dummies on that as well.
Wow.
So that was inquired.
So, okay, so
we moved forward in time. Bearing in mind, John didn't talk anymore. I got this name, Spiros. What do you do with that? I worked with a colleague of mine called Russell Callahan. Russell had started his own little magazine called UFO Data. Out of the blue, we're jumping forward in time. I think it's 2006.
Okay.
And he says, Philip, I just got a phone call from a fella. I think you should speak to him. Here's his phone number. I said, what did he want? He says, he claims he's the man that made the Alien Autopsy film. So what's his name? It's Spiros Malaris. Spiros. I phoned him, and as soon as I started talking to him, Alan, he was filling in all the missing pieces.
Sure.
Literally,
Why spend so much time and effort creating that? I mean, was it all for financial gain? How much did one invest in that?
This is the story behind it. I've got a book called Roswell Alien Autopsy. The whole story's in there. Spiros, when we go back in time to 1995, he was a magician, was a filmmaker. He'd also trained as a young lad as a motor mechanic. So he got a number of skills. He ran his own little film company at the time. They do pop videos, whatever. In France, there is a TV festival as well as a film festival every year at Cannes. And he was going to the festival, and he got a trade directory out, and he faxed and random picked some places out that were close to where his business was centered in London. Faxed them and said, I'm going to be in Cannes. I've got a crew with me. If you want, if you want some to hire, we're there, basically. And one of those was Ray Santilli's company called the Merlin Group. He met Ray Santilli. He told him this crazy story, about the cameraman and whatever. He came back to England. He went and met Santilli. He showed him the film, and he said, that's fake. He said, I can do better than that. So off he went, and he said he was a good friend of John Humphreys. In fact, he was his best friend. And they hatched the plot with Ray Santilli to make the Alien Autopsy film. But according to Spiros, it wasn't for money.
It was a challenge.
The idea behind it was, we will make it, we will fool the world, and then 6 months, 9 months later, we'll go, ta-da, the big reveal, it was us. Aren't we great? Why didn't you come and hire us? But Santilli had another piece of film that's never been shown on television. He was still claiming he'd bought this other piece of film. and he hadn't made his money back. So Spiros said, fine, okay. They signed a non-disclosure agreement. I'll see you later. And he would work on occasion with Santilli and do a bit of business. Spiros not interested in the alien autopsy film. Didn't really know what had happened to it. It was oblivious. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the movie came up. I told you Santilli had signed up to do a movie. There's a little coincidence here. I was working for a lady then, and she said, I've got my boyfriend coming. So boyfriend was a barrister. And he turned up for lunch one day. We had no idea she had a boyfriend, but he was from London. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, in court, he said, no, although I trained as a barrister, I don't do any court work. I do contractual law. So if you've got a contract for anything, you want me to check it, my boss knew of my interest and involvement in the alien autopsy film. Guess what he had in his briefcase? He had the contract for Ray Santilli and his business partner, Gary Shoefield, to make the movie Alien Autopsy. And he showed me it and let me read it. Wouldn't let me copy it, but sure. I read it. And that was amazing. Yeah. So when Spiros started talking about this, he'd not seen that contract. He'd never seen it to this very day. I did. So, Spiros said, that was it. He said, the game was up. I told them when they started to make the movie, we should now tell the truth. But they said they still wanted to manufacture the lie. So it was. Then he went online and found out what had happened to the alien autopsy film. He was amazed. Yeah. Now, there is a little...
So he wasn't in step with what was happening in popular culture.
No. I mean, he was running his own TV studio. He got a life. He had several businesses. But there's a little strange thing here. What people don't realize, Alan, there are 2 separate autopsy films. Same creature, same environment. One that we've all seen on television, and you just show pictures of, has got a big hole in its leg, or burnt. Mm-hmm. The other one is fully intact. There's no damage. That's never been seen anywhere apart from in Ray Santilli's office. I've seen it. My wife's seen it. A few others have seen it. What happened was they sculpt the dummy. They make it. So they've got the dummy on the table. They're all in the white suits that Spiros made himself. He made the table that it's laid on. It's actually filmed in a set. They built the set in his sister's apartment because she was having it renovated anyway. Mm-hmm. It didn't make any difference that they made a bit of mess. And Spiros's girlfriend at the time was the one who did the research for the medical side of things. Uh-huh. There's no internet. Yep. So there's books, libraries. So they go over what they've done that day. They've got this creature on the slab. It's perfect. There's no damage to it. They cut it open, take the brain out. They review it. She says, that's wrong.
Ah, interesting.
You show that on television, you're done with instantly. So Santilli's crying, we've used up all our money. Spiros says, I'll pay for another one to be done. We've got the mold. Uh-huh. We just need to pay the crew and the bits and pieces. So they make the other one overnight, open it up in the morning, and there's a problem with it. It's got a big hole in its leg. There's been an air pocket in the mold. So they improvise. They go to the butchers. They get some bones of an animal, stick that in. They burn it, and they improvise.
Wow.
They cut it open, film it. That's the one that everybody's seen on television or video or wherever.
I think that's what makes it more convincing. Not.
So here's the problem. Santilli is the guy who promoted it, but Spiros is the man who paid for that one to be made.
So who owns it then, technically?
Well, Spiros has filed a copyright claim, and that has been accepted. He's also put a claim in on IMDb as being the guy that made it.
Well, I don't know what the original one looks like, but the one that we all are familiar with, I think it's the fact that it is so fleshy, because even though that was an accident, that the leg had kind of, air pocket had bursted open. They had to improvise. I think it's because of that it triggers an emotional response in people.
Here's another little coincidence for you. I have a good friend who is a special effects artist. I didn't know him at the time of the Alien Autopsy film, but we met not long after. He was actually working on Lord of the Rings in New Zealand with Peter Jackson. And so when he came back to England, we got into the subject of the alien autopsy. I mean, my friend can make anything. Sadly, he doesn't work in the business now. He's ill, but he can make anything. And I said, if I were to say to you in 1995, how much, your cheapest rate, could you make that film for me? And he said £30,000. So I asked Spiros Malaris, how much money did you have up, to make the alien autopsy? He said £35,000. Oh, wow. So my mate wasn't far off, you know. But Spiros claims ownership of it because the one that they used all the money on has never been released. The one that we've all seen is the one he paid for. They made it the next day. That's his money that made that. And that's the one that was sold to television companies around the world.
Well, I remember watching that on Fox Fact or Fiction, and it was very captivating, and it was highly talked about. Yeah. And I wonder, did it hurt the credibility?
No. This is a question that's been asked many times. The Roswell alien autopsy was the biggest story of its kind. I mean, it was huge. Yeah. So the interest in both Roswell and UFOs in general, it was released at the height of the X-Files craze as well. Yep. Went through the roof. I'll give you an example of that. A colleague here in the UK who complained bitterly that we were making money off it because we were showing it at our conference and how wrong it was and all this kind of stuff. I just happened to know that she had a book out at that time, at that point. Coincidentally, it was. When I spoke to her publisher had to reprint it because it sold out. So even though she was complaining about the commerciality of it, even she had benefited indirectly because people had gone to buy UFO books. She just happened to have one out at the time. So the interest, I mean, the conference was packed out. We had film crews from around the world there. So there was a huge amount of interest. And by the time it got released, the internet was just starting. It was the first sort of UFO argument on the internet. And you can still find bits of it now, and it was amazing. It really was. But as I pointed out, a lot of people went, it's a fake, it's fake, it's fake. Nobody could prove it was a fake. Even Philip Klass, we mentioned arch debunker Philip Klass. Sure. I met him in Connecticut, I think it was Connecticut. No, North Carolina in 1996 at the MUFON convention. And I sat and had a conversation with him. He said, well, it's a hoax. I said, well, prove it then, Philip. Yeah. You just prove it.
Although it's got to be hard to prove because you don't know the biology, right, of an alien species. So you don't really know what you're looking at other than it's realistic looking. Yeah. So it is difficult to disprove that.
So I just say, look, if you know it's a fake, you prove it's a fake. Yeah. So I've often argued that it wasn't a skeptic or a debunker that proved it to be a fake. It was me, and I stuck at it through thick and thin, through accusations of being called an accomplice and making tons of money off it and all this other nonsense. Well, I stuck at it. I didn't think it'd take that long, Alan, to be honest, but I got there in the end. And there's still people that don't believe it. There's still people think it's authentic, of course, and it will never die.
Yeah, you've been through the alien body, the alien mummy situation, so we don't need to spend time on that. But after all of this, is there now a line that you draw somewhere, whether it's people sharing abduction stories, or are there any aspects of this research that you just say, I won't go there?
Well, I spoke to a colleague last year about, in general, UFO photos, because when I wrote the young persons introducing UFOs, in the center of it, I have a UFO photo file. First one we use is a fake from Project Blue Book, and we tell them it's a fake. So I asked colleagues around the world, have you got any genuine UFO photographs that, in your opinion, I can put in this book?
Mm-hmm.
But I had one colleague, and he said, I don't touch them anymore, Philip. I will not investigate a piece of film or a photograph of an alleged UFO because the technology has got so good to be able to fake them now.
Yeah.
I won't touch it. I will not touch it. As simple as that. So I'm not the same, but I'm not far behind him when it comes to film and photographs. What is interesting, Alan, cameras are more available now than they've ever been on your cell phone, CCTV camera. I mean, they're everywhere. But the quality of UFO photographs seems to have got worse.
That's getting better.
And what's most common now is, I took this photograph on my cell phone of my girlfriend, and I didn't realize this thing in the background. And it's a bird, but it's blurred a bit, and it looks kind of, and they won't believe you. So, yeah.
Do you remember that video? It was a Utah UFO. I think it came out in 2018, but it was originally filmed, I think, in 2012, and it was a high definition recorded video, a mountainscape, and there was this UFO or something that came. It looked like it came from behind the mountains through the frame and crossed, pretty close to the camera. Do you remember that case?
No, I'm not aware of that.
That's the one video that I have seen, and I've seen it analyzed many times, that is the most convincing. You want to think that it's a bug, but when you look at
it's funny you should mention that, because not that long ago there was the craze that was called rods.
Rods, right? I remember rods, but that was before digital cell phone cameras.
But
right?
They were bugs, and there were bugs close to the lens and are a bit blurred, but there's people that believe them. So, I don't have a line to draw, but there is one sort of vaguely there or thereabouts. If anybody says I've got a film of an alien in my fridge or whatever, I'd say, well, I'm not interested. I've been there and done that. No.
Well, still, it seems to me most sightings tend to be far away in the sky. They're just distant UFO sightings at nighttime or even during the day. So even if it's daytime, you really can't see much more than a silvery reflective object of some sort. Now, my guess is always that as we advance our technology, clearly if they're watching us, they know our technology's improved. So if you really don't want to be caught, then they know to kind of step back, right? So I think our assumption was, the more cameras we have in the sky, better tech, we're going to eventually catch one of these things, indisputably. But that's not the case.
Well, that's one of the reasons why in the next book that I've written, UFO Landings UK, I use Hynek's classification, which he talked about high strangeness. And he talked about in his classification system the lights, etc. But he was more or less saying we should concentrate on the up close and personal things. And the high strangeness factor, in other words, the weirder they are, Alan, the more likely they are to be real.
You think so?
And I've used that kind of yardstick with writing the book. And there are some really weird cases in it. Bizarre. And I mean really bizarre. And I was thinking about trying to do a high strangeness number. This is high strangeness 1, and I couldn't. There was. I would have been here, or I've still been trying to figure it out now. There was a couple of cases that was so bizarre. I said, well, should I really put these in the book or not? But they've gone in, and you, the reader, will be able to make up your own mind when you read it. But
well, I know, Philip, from my conversations with alleged abductees, on occasion I speak to someone and I really have doubt, and I get the sense sometimes they're either exaggerating, embellishing a true story, or it's mostly fabricated, and they're building a sort of business online. So I appreciate what you say, because in a sense it does make sense that the more outlandish it is, it's actually probably more likely to be true. But there are so many outlandish stories out there that I do have doubts about.
Absolutely. I mean, like we said, do you have an inclination if some people's lying or not? Well, the answer is no, you don't. And when you do two different things. You can be a researcher and an author. Mm-hmm. The two are sometimes separate entities. And as an author, you will use other people's material, and you will allow your reader to draw their own conclusion at the end of it, about either the whole book or individual accounts that are in it. But as a researcher, if you're investigating a case or working on a particular case, it is all down to you, unless you work with other colleagues, of course. And that's why I talked about the Pascagoula case, because there's so many independent sources of material that seem to confirm that something happened. Mm-hmm. None of these witnesses know each other. I think none of them's ever really met each other, apart from one little video we made. Yeah. We were thinking about having a little convention in Pascagoula, but the pandemic has put paid to that for the time being. But so, the two things can be entirely different.
Well, for someone who won't make an absolute assertion as to the existence of extraterrestrials, you have a lot of alien heads in your background.
Yeah, well, I collect this stuff. I started a long time ago, and it just seems to multiply. I turn around and there's something else there, Alan.
It kind of goes with the territory, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it also what it does, of course, it reflects popular culture.
Yes.
And again, we'll go back to the Pascagoula case. It is firmly within popular culture, although it's not as obvious as we would imagine. For example, one of the most well-known rock bands is Fleetwood Mac. Sure. And they wrote a song called Hypnotized. And it is partially based on Charlie and Calvin's encounter. If you go to the Alien Autopsy film, it's everywhere. You could buy an Alien Autopsy Halloween cake at one point in the States. You could buy a game where you take the alien apart and remove its innards, So this stuff reflects popular culture as well. Yeah. And whether we like it or not, the UFO subject in general is linked with popular culture.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Fleetwood Mac. Do you remember that video that went viral with the guy in New Mexico, I think it was? And he was carrying his cranberry juice. He was just recording himself on video playing a Fleetwood Mac song. It went so viral that Fleetwood Mac, that song went to the top of the charts.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, Dreams. I think it was Dreams.
Yeah, well, Fleetwood Mac had a song called Hypnotized, and it's partially based on the Pascagoula case.
That is really fascinating. And there's Tom DeLonge in the late 90s, or early 2000s, I think it was. He wrote a song based on UFO encounters. I mean, it has, it's in all aspects of our culture. And that's why I think UFO will likely stay around and not UAP, because it is a pop culture phenomenon now.
In the 70s and 80s, we had a pop group here called Hot Chocolate, that were very popular, and they had a UFO landing song called No Doubt About It. And the video with it was a flying saucer landing. The lead singer was a black guy called Errol Brown, and people would interview him and say, "Did you really see this, Errol?" And he'd just say, "Oh, yeah." So when I started to write the book on UFO landings, I looked into it, and I tracked down one of the writers of the song. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't the singer or the band that saw it. It was actually the two guys that wrote the song. They actually saw it. It's a chap called Steve Glenn. And I interviewed Steve on the telephone. He told me the whole story, and it's in the book. So, and he said, "Quickest song I ever wrote, Philip."
Yeah, some of the best songs are the ones that come from an intense experience, whether it's a relationship or a UFO. John Lennon, he had witnessed a UFO as well. There's so many credible people, artists, airline pilots, military people on all levels and aspects of society have witnessed this phenomena. So my take is there really is a phenomenon, and that seems to be your take as well. The question is what is it? Do you think you'll get an answer to what's behind the phenomena at all?
I've got some answers down the years, but by no means the ultimate answer. The way I look at, your job as a UFO researcher, as we talked earlier about the early archaeologists and the early astronomers, they added to the growing data pool of information. And at some point, there was a point where somebody could actually make sense of what was happening and what they were studying. Yeah. So I look upon this job as the same kind of thing. We all add things to the pool of data, and at some point, hopefully, there'll be a definitive conclusion one way or another. That may be tomorrow, maybe in 100 years' time. There's no way of knowing.
Philip, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. It was a fascinating conversation. So where do you want people to go to find out more about your works?
You can just go to Flying Disc Press. If you put Flying Disc Press, disc with a K, you'll find me. And I'm online and I'm on Facebook. I'm easy to find, no problem.
All right. Well, I hope you'll get over here sometime and do some conferences at some point.
That would be nice. That would be nice.
All right, because I've not yet been to England, but one day I would absolutely.
Well, forget London. Come to Yorkshire. You won't be disappointed.
All right. Well, we're in the city now, and I have to tell you, we're looking outside of the city to live in the more wooded areas of New York because it's, there's so much beauty out there. We love this life here, but I appreciate, the smaller towns now more than I used to. I'm not that anti, teenager, leaving the small town that I, grew up from.
When
I was younger, I was like, I'm going to go to the city. That's where real life is. And now I'm beginning to realize real life is everywhere. And some of the best parts of it are those smaller towns and communities. So, Philip, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us as well. As usual, you can find out more about future shows at kgradb.com, Paranormal Now, and other shows like Behind the Obsidian Curtain with Carol Carl. This is a great station. I love KGRA. It's the best in alternative talk radio. So I hope to see... Okay, sorry about that. I just lost the audio for a second, everyone. So I'll see you on next week, Sunday, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Paranormal Now. And until next time, live in the mystery.